Her face went up on national television under one word: gold digger. A company chairwoman filed to end her marriage within days of the story breaking. That's not actually why the marriage was in danger. The real threat was 37 years old, buried in the same family's own history. The woman trying to destroy her was hiding something worse than anything she'd been accused of.
Welcome to K-Drama Afro Tales. Like, share and subscribe, because neither of them knew how close they actually were to the same story until it was almost too late to stop it. Let's go.
The Chiron came up 3 seconds before her face did. Gold Digger Bride. The secret wife of Han Industries' heir. The anchor had the voice for it, low, unhurried, the specific cadence Korean broadcast news reserved for stories they wanted to sound like concern rather than spectacle. Behind him, a bank of monitors looped the same 3 seconds of footage on repeat. A woman crossing a hotel lobby in Accra, caught at a bad angle by a long lens, sunglasses pushed up into her braids, a phone pressed to her ear. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't hiding either. She simply hadn't known, in that instant, that anyone was watching her closely enough to make her into something. A production assistant refreshed a feed on his phone without looking up. Nobody in the newsroom looked away from the screen. Sources inside Han Industries confirm the marriage has been concealed for over a year, the anchor said, raising serious questions about the timing, given the succession vote scheduled for later this month. The graphic changed. Beside the looping footage, an old company directory photo went up, professional, unsmiling, no context, no year attached. Just the label first, Gold Digger Bride in red-edged block letters, and her face arriving second, to fill in whatever the label had already decided about her. The segment ended on the anchor turning a practice fraction toward the camera, the specific angle that meant the line the whole piece had been built around was coming. Tonight, we ask, what does she actually want from this family? Cut to commercial. On every monitor in the building, for one more second before the loop reset, her face stayed frozen under the word, waiting the way a photograph always waits, for someone else to decide whether it was true. A year earlier, in a conference room in Accra with the Harmattan light coming gray and flat through the blinds, that same woman had made 4 men wait 11 minutes to finish talking before she said a single word. Her name was Abina, and she had learned a long time ago, in rooms very much like this one, that the men who mattered most were rarely the ones who spoke first. Director O, seated directly across from her, had spent those 11 minutes explaining, in the patient, over-articulated way people used when they decided English was doing her a favor rather than the reverse, why a smaller shipment allocation made more sense at this stage of the relationship. Beside her, Efua sat with a pen resting exactly where it had been resting for the last 40 minutes. Her notes a neat, economical shorthand that Abina had trained into her over 3 years of exactly these kinds of meetings. Neither of them had moved to interrupt. At the far end of the table, one man had said almost nothing. Not shy, she'd clocked that within the first 5 minutes, the way she clocked everything in a room before she decided how to use it. He listened the way people listened when they were actually deciding something, rather than simply waiting for their turn to talk. Director O finally ran out of ways to say the same sentence. Abina let a beat of silence sit in the room before she answered it, because a beat of silence, deployed correctly, said more than most objections could. At this stage of the relationship, she said, we've delivered 18 months of on-time shipment data with a variance under 2%. I'd love to know which stage of a relationship requires more proof than that. Director O smiled, the specific smile of a man regrouping in real time. The board is simply cautious about favoritism optics, shall we say. A newer partner moving too quickly can invite scrutiny it doesn't deserve, but invites all the same. Then let the numbers invite the scrutiny. She slid a folder into the center of the table, not toward Director O specifically, but into the space between all 4 men, so that no single one of them could claim he was the one she was actually negotiating with. Cost per unit, landed. Compare it against your current supplier out of TEMA. Compare the insurance claims history while you're at it. I'm not asking anyone in this room to trust me. I'm asking you to read what's in front of you. The quiet man at the end of the table reached for the folder before Director O's hand had finished moving toward it. He read for longer than the page strictly required, long enough that Abina noted it, filed it, decided it meant something without yet knowing what. When he looked up, His expression hadn't changed, which she respected considerably more than if it had. 14%, he said. Not a question. A number arrived at 14 once you factor the insurance differential properly. I rounded down. Director O opened his mouth to steer the room back toward caution, toward stages, toward the comfortable vagueness that let men in rooms like this avoid saying yes to a woman they hadn't expected to hold the floor for this long. We'll take the 14, the quiet man said, before Director O could get a word out. The room recalibrated visibly around the sentence. Director O's jaw did something small and controlled, a man swallowing a version of the meeting he'd walked in expecting to have. Efua's pen finally moved. One clean check mark in the margin of her notes. Nothing more. The sum total of her reaction to what had just happened. Abina didn't smile either. She had learned that lesson even earlier than the one about silence. The moment you won a room, the room kept watching to see what you did next with the win, and the only safe thing to do with it was keep working as though nothing unusual had occurred. Then I'll have the revised terms to your legal team by Friday, she said, closing her own folder with the unhurried finality of someone who had never once doubted this was how the meeting would end. Soul time, not Accra time. I know your office keeps missing that distinction. The meeting ended the ordinary way meetings ended. Chairs scraping back. Someone already thumbing through messages on a phone that had been sitting face down for the last hour. Low murmurs of goodbye exchanged in two languages at once. But as the delegation filed toward the door, the quiet man paused half a step behind the others, just long enough that it could have meant nothing at all, and looked back at her once. She held it, didn't glance away first. That, too, was a habit, built the same way all her useful habits had been built, deliberately over years until it no longer felt like a decision. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind the last of them, and Efua exhaled like she'd been holding her breath through the entire back half of the meeting. 14%, Efua said. You didn't tell me you were going for 14. I wasn't, until Director O said, stage of the relationship, for the third time. Abina gathered her papers, already 3 thoughts ahead into the shipment schedule this particular concession was going to require of her team. Some people only understand the language of what it costs them not to trust you. Efua glanced toward the door, toward where the delegation's footsteps were still fading down the corridor. And the quiet one doesn't say a word for 40 minutes and then closes a 14% deal on his own authority. He listens, Abina said, and found, a little to her own surprise, that she meant it as a compliment, a rarer thing than it should have been in the rooms she usually occupied. She didn't think about him again that afternoon, or told herself she didn't. But that night, reviewing the revised terms one final time before sending them to legal, she found herself remembering, unbidden, the particular stillness of his attention across the table, the way he'd held the folder a beat longer than the numbers alone required, as though he'd been checking for something in it besides the math. 11 months later, in an apartment 40 floors above a soul that was busy turning from gold to blue outside the window, Junho stood at the kitchen counter pouring 2 coffees. Hers black, his with too much milk, the small unspoken choreography of 2 people who had never once discussed the rule and simply followed it anyway. Every single evening, without either of them remembering when it had started. You're staring at that coffee like it insulted you, Abina said from the couch, not looking up from the tablet balanced on her knees. I'm thinking. Dangerous. I was going to say something sentimental, and I've decided against it. She looked up at that, one eyebrow lifting, the expression that had, somewhere in the last year, quietly become the thing he thought of first whenever he thought of her face at rest. You can't announce that you're withholding sentiment and then actually withhold it. That's not how the rule works. Once you've said the sentence out loud, you're obligated. There's no rule. There is absolutely a rule. I invented it just now, which means it's binding. He crossed the room and sat close enough that their shoulders touched. The one specific, small physical fact that neither of them ever got to have in any other room in either of their lives. The only place where the arithmetic of who might be watching simply didn't apply. I like Tuesdays, he said, finally into her hair. Specifically, not Wednesdays. That's not sentimental, Junho. That's a diagnosable condition. You work from home on Tuesdays. You leave the office door open. I can hear you being absolutely terrifying to men twice your age over the phone. and it's the best part of my week. She laughed, the real one low in her throat, the one that never once made it into a boardroom in either country. Director O called again last week, still sulking about the 14% after all this time. Tells your mother it was a clerical error every chance he gets. I've stopped correcting him. It's easier to let him believe whatever version helps him sleep. Let him sulk. It's cheaper than being wrong out loud, and he knows it, which is the actual insult. They sat like that for a long while, the light outside sliding from gold to a deepening blue, neither of them reaching for a lamp, the city's glass towers throwing the last of the color back doubled through the window. It was the specific kind of silence that didn't need filling, the rare, unearned luxury of two people who had already said the hard things to each other and could now simply exist inside the aftermath of having said them. The board set the date, Junho said eventually, quiet, into the top of her head. She went still, not dramatically, just a fraction, a stillness he had learned over the past year to read the way other people learn to read a raised voice. Which date? The vote. 6 weeks. Abina didn't sit up. She let out a slow breath instead, the sound of someone rerunning a timeline she'd already run 100 times in the abstract and was now, for the first time, running for real. 6 weeks, she repeated, testing the number's actual weight now that it had a date attached to it. 6 weeks, he said again, and neither of them moved to turn on a light. Later, the coffee gone cold on the side table, the apartment fully dark now except for the kitchen they hadn't bothered to close off. Abina sat across from him at the small table where they ate the meals no one else in either of their lives knew they shared. Say it plainly, she said. Not the version you give the board. The real one, the one you'd give me if we had all the time in the world instead of 6 weeks of it. Junho turned his cup a quarter turn, a small habit she'd come to recognize as the outward sign of him choosing his words with unusual care. My grandfather's will ties control of the company to the vote. The vote requires a board-approved marriage. If I'm not married to someone they've properly vetted, someone who reads as strategic rather than personal, Taemin inherits by default. Not because he's better suited to it, because I'd be disqualified on a technicality neither of us chose. And I'm not board-approved. You're not board-approved, he said evenly, with no apology folded into it, because they'd had this exact conversation enough times by now that apology would have insulted both of them. If they knew today, before the vote, it wouldn't read as a marriage at all. It would read as a liability I'd hidden from them. That's not fair to either of us. It's simply what's true. Abina nodded slowly, turning her own cup in an unconscious mirror of his gesture, neither of them noticing the echo. Then you understand why I need it quiet too. It's not the same reason. I need you to actually hear that it's not the same reason. Say your version, not the shortened one you give me when you're tired and want the conversation over. She almost smiled at that, the specific discomfort of being known well enough to be caught abbreviating her own truths. The partnership took 18 months to build. Every number in it is mine. Every relationship, every late night convincing men like Director O that I wasn't some kind of accident in his paperwork. She looked at him directly. If the board finds out I'm married to the heir before that partnership is fully proven on its own terms, it stops being a trade relationship in anyone's eyes. It becomes favoritism. Everything I built gets read as something given to me instead of something I earned. And once a room decides that's the story, no amount of shipment data ever undoes it. I've watched that exact thing happen to other women. I am not going to be the next one. So we're protecting two different things. Two real things, she said. Not the same thing wearing two different names so it's easier to say out loud. Yours is about who inherits a company. Mine is about whether anyone, ever again, takes my work seriously without an asterisk attached to it. She reached across the small table and set her hand over his, not dramatically, just present. I need you to actually understand that distinction, Junho. Because if you ever start believing my silence is really about protecting us, it isn't. Not only. It's about protecting something that belongs to me specifically. He turned his hand over beneath hers, an answer that didn't require words. I know what's yours. Do you? I watched you get 14% out of Director O in under an hour, he said. I know exactly what's yours. It should have been a small thing the way he said it. It wasn't. Something in her chest eased anyway. The specific relief of a woman who is perpetually braced for the moment a man decides her success is secretly about him, discovering, once again, that this particular man hadn't. 6 weeks, she said, testing the number now that it had finally settled between them. Fully. 6 weeks. Then the vote happens, the succession is settled, and we get to figure out the rest of it from somewhere that isn't standing directly on top of a landmine. And until then, nothing changes. Same as it's been. Same as it's been, she agreed and meant it as a vow, the quiet kind, the kind made at a kitchen table instead of an altar, which suited both of them fine, since the altar had already happened in secret a year earlier, and this was simply the part where they kept choosing it over and over in a room no one else was allowed into. Neither of them said out loud the thing both of them were quietly thinking, that a plan this reasonable, agreed to by 2 people this careful, should have been more than enough to hold. The discrepancy was small enough that anyone less compulsive than Abina would have closed the file after the first pass and never opened it again. She'd almost done exactly that, twice. It was past 8 in the evening, the Accra office mostly emptied out for the night, the ceiling fans turning slow, useless circles against the Harmattan heat, and she'd only pulled the archival shipment ledgers in the first place because a junior analyst had flagged an old pricing anomaly during a routine audit, the kind of thing that usually resolved itself on closer inspection, as a currency conversion error or a decimal misplaced sometime before anyone had bothered to digitize the records properly. This one didn't resolve. "You're still here," Efua said, appearing in the doorway with her bag already over one shoulder, the universal posture of a colleague hoping very much that the answer would be no. "Look at this." Abina didn't glance up from the screen. 1987. Cocoa Futures Contract, the original trade agreement between the co-op and the conglomerate's predecessor company. The volume logged doesn't match the payout logged. Not by a rounding error. By nearly 40%. 40% of a 37-year-old contract. Abina. 40% that somebody, at some point, had to physically sign off on. Efua crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the scanned ledger page. The ink faded to a soft brown. The signatures at the bottom worn illegible enough that they could have belonged to almost anyone. It's an old ledger. It's not our department. It's not even our decade. It's the exact trade relationship we're currently operating inside of. If the foundation of it is rotten. It's not rotten, it's old. Old things develop errors in them. That is, more or less, the entire definition of old. Efua said it kindly, in the tone of someone who had watched Abina chase a loose thread before and knew, from prior experience, precisely how far she'd follow it if nobody thought to stop her. You have a board presentation in 9 days. You have a husband you are not, technically, supposed to have. You do not currently need a 37-year-old accounting mystery on top of either of those things. Abina finally looked up from the screen. Doesn't it bother you? That no one has ever bothered to explain it. Plenty of things go unexplained. That's not automatically the same as being a secret. Sometimes it is exactly the same, Abina said quietly, not really arguing so much as filing the observation away for later use. She turned back to the ledger, to the mismatched numbers sitting there, patient and entirely unbothered. The way numbers always were until someone finally decided to ask them a question they hadn't been designed to answer easily. I'm not going to chase it tonight. I have the board presentation exactly as you said, and I intend to actually prepare for it properly. But I want the earlier records. Before this one, further back. If there's an anomaly at this specific point in the ledger, I want to know whether it's the first time it happened, or simply the first time somebody wrote it down badly enough for anyone to eventually notice. Efua sighed, the particular sigh of a colleague who had already lost this argument and was only now, belatedly, hearing herself lose it out loud. You're going to request archival access. Under your own name. 9 days before the single biggest presentation of your career. I'm going to request archival access, Abina agreed, already typing, the request form open in the adjacent tab. Because if I don't ask the question now, while it's small and boring and nobody is watching me ask it, I will end up having to ask it later once it isn't small anymore and once everybody is watching. She hit submit before she could talk herself out of it. A small, entirely ordinary click, the kind that didn't feel, in the moment, like the beginning of anything at all. Efua watched her a moment longer, shook her head, and reached for the light switch on her way out, leaving Abina alone with the ledger, the fan turning overhead in its slow, useless circles, and a request now logged, time-stamped, sitting in some records office in Seoul with her name attached to it. Findable, the way anything written down eventually became findable, by anyone who happened to be looking closely enough. Junho found his mother in the office she had occupied since before he was old enough to understand what any of the furniture in it actually meant. The same desk, repositioned twice over the decades but never once replaced. The same view of the Han Industries campus spread out below the window like a kingdom she had built with her own 2 hands and had never, not even once, let him fully inherit before he'd earned it properly in her eyes. An approval he had spent the better part of his adult life failing to permanently secure. "You didn't call me," he said, closing the door behind him. "You issued a statement about my marriage, without calling me first or at all." Han didn't look up immediately from the document in front of her. "I called you the moment I had something worth telling you, rather than a problem to hand you unfinished. That isn't the same as calling me." "It is exactly the same, Junho. I have spent 30 years learning the difference between reacting to a crisis and actually responding to one, and it is a difference that has kept this company alive through mornings considerably worse than this one." She finally set the document down and looked at him directly, her expression carrying the particular blend of exhaustion and total control that he had learned, as a boy, always meant the conversation had already been decided before he'd walked into the room. "Sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to stop." "Stop what, precisely?" "The annulment. Whatever grounds you're inventing for it. Stop it before it becomes something none of us can walk back." Hans studied him for a long moment, something in her expression recalibrating. The look of a negotiator realizing in real time that the person across the table wasn't going to simply absorb the terms she'd handed him without argument. "You think I enjoy this? I think you're very good at it. That's a different thing from not enjoying it. I am protecting the only thing your grandfather left behind that actually matters," she said, and something moved beneath the surface of her control that he couldn't quite name, close enough to notice, gone again before he could be certain he'd seen it at all. "You want me to set that aside because you've fallen in love. I want you to set aside a humiliation campaign against a woman who has built something real, with her own 2 hands, in a country you've barely bothered to learn the shape of." Something flickered across Han's face at that, brief, sharp, and vanished again before he could name what it had actually been. "Sit down, Junho. I told you. Sit down." It wasn't quite a shout, and it wasn't a request either. It was the specific, practiced authority of a woman who had never once, in his entire adult life, needed to raise her voice in order to be obeyed. He sat despite himself, the old muscle memory of childhood asserting itself faster than his adult resolve could override it, and hated, quietly, how easily it happened even now. Han came around the desk and sat on its edge, close enough that the register of the conversation shifted entirely. No longer chairwoman and heir, something closer, briefly, to a mother and her son. "The alliance discussion with the Song family moves forward this week," she said. "You will attend the introduction dinner on Thursday. You will be visibly, publicly available because that is precisely what the board needs to see in order to approve you at the vote, regardless of whatever else is happening in the background of your life." "I'm not marrying someone else, Mother. I'm already married. You're attending a dinner. Nobody has asked you to sign anything." Her voice had returned fully to its controlled register, the brief crack sealed back over as though it had never opened at all. Whether the current marriage survives the vote, procedurally, is a separate question entirely from whether you attend a single dinner that keeps your options, and this family's succession, intact while that separate question is being resolved. "And if I refuse, then you hand Taemin the company by default, and you can explain to your wife, whose entire livelihood depends on this family's trade relationships remaining intact, exactly how that particular decision protected her." Han stood, already reaching for the document she'd set aside the moment he'd entered. The conversation, from her perspective, plainly concluded. Thursday, 7 o'clock. Wear the navy suit, not the black. The Song family reads black as funerary at an introduction. It's a small thing, but it matters more than you'd think. Junho stood too, slower than he'd sat. "This isn't over." "No," she agreed, not looking up from the papers. "It isn't. That's rather the point, Junho. Nothing that actually matters is ever over as quickly as the people standing inside it would prefer it to be. He left without another word because there was nothing left to say that she hadn't already, somehow, preempted, and it was only once he was alone in the elevator, watching the floor numbers count down in silence, that he let himself register what the meeting had actually cost him. Not a victory, not even a real concession, just the private, sinking knowledge that the tools that worked on absolutely everyone else in his life didn't work on this one. He had walked in intending to stop something and walked out instead with a dinner reservation and a wardrobe instruction, and somewhere on the long descent to the lobby, he made a quiet decision he wasn't proud of. Not to tell Abina about the dinner yet. Not tonight. Not until he understood himself what it meant that he'd already agreed to go. By the time she stepped out of the office and onto the street, the reporter had been waiting long enough that Abina clocked her before Efua did. A woman in a gray coat, positioned with the studied, deliberate casualness of someone who wanted it to look accidental when it plainly wasn't. She fell into step beside them the moment they cleared the entrance, phone already raised, the small red recording light steady and unblinking. Ms. Abina, can I ask you directly? Were you aware of the succession votes timeline before you agreed to keep the marriage secret? Abina kept walking. Efua, beside her, slowed half a step, the reflex of someone bracing to physically intervene if it came to that. Just one comment, the reporter said, keeping pace easily, not aggressive exactly, simply relentless in the specific way of someone who had been told not to return without something usable. The public deserves to hear your side of it. Right now, the only story out there belongs to the family. Don't you want the chance to correct it? They reached the car. Efua opened the door and glanced at Abina, a question in it that never became verbal. Say something, don't say something, I will follow whichever you choose. One sentence. The reporter pressed closer now. That's genuinely all I'm asking for. Anything. It's not what it looks like. I love him. Anything human at all, instead of the silence that everyone watching is going to read as guilt. Abina stopped, one hand resting on the top of the open car door, and looked at the reporter directly for the first time. Not with anger, which would have made an easy, usable clip, and not with fear, which would have made an even easier one. Just the same level, unhurried attention she had once turned on Director O across a negotiating table a year and a lifetime ago. Not today, she said, and it cost her something real to say it. A small, specific ache low in her chest, the physical sensation of choosing discipline over the relief of finally putting something down that she'd been carrying too long already. When I have something worth saying, you'll hear it directly from me. Today isn't that day. That's going to read as guilt too, you understand. Silence usually does, whether it's fair or not. I know, Abina said, and got into the car. Efua slid in beside her and pulled the door shut, and the reporter's face slid past the window as the car pulled away from the curb, already turning back toward the entrance, already scanning the sidewalk for someone else worth waiting for. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Efua watched her carefully, the way she'd watched her across 100 negotiating tables over the years, trying to read whether the stillness in Abina's face was strategy or something closer to breaking apart quietly from the inside. You could have said something, Efua said finally, gentle, not an accusation, more an opening left carefully ajar. One sentence. It wouldn't have cost you anything real. It would have cost me everything real. Abina stared out the window at the city sliding past. Glass and gray sky and, somewhere inside it, a version of her own face still looping on a screen under a word she had never once agreed to. The moment I hand them a sentence, I've confirmed that the story is something I need to respond to on their terms, in their format, on their timeline. One sentence becomes a soundbite. A soundbite becomes, sources say she seemed defensive. I've watched this exact thing happen to other people, Efua. You do not get to control a story once you've stepped inside someone else's frame for telling it. So we just let them win the silence, then? I'm not losing the silence, Abina said, quieter now, and there was something underneath the words that wasn't quite fear but was close enough to it to share a border. The sound of a woman convincing herself of a plan even as she stated it out loud for the first time. I'm using it. There's a real difference. I just need you and everyone else in my life to trust that difference for a little while longer than feels comfortable to any of us. Efua didn't answer right away. She reached over instead and took Abina's hand. A small gesture, not dramatic in the slightest, the kind of thing offered only between two people who had built a decade of trust out of exactly this sort of unglamorous, unwitnessed loyalty, in cars and hallways and late offices no one else would ever know about. "Okay," Efua said. "But when you do have something to say, you say it to me first. Not to a camera. Not to him, even. Me." Abina's hand tightened around hers, just briefly, and she let out a breath she hadn't fully realized. Until that moment, she'd been holding. "You'll be the first call. I promise you that." The car merged into evening traffic, carrying them both away from the reporter, away from the office, away from the version of this particular afternoon where she'd taken the easier road and handed someone else the raw material to define her with for good. And though nothing about the last 5 minutes looked, from the outside, like anything of consequence had happened at all, Abina understood, with the particular clarity of a woman keeping careful score against herself, that she had just paid a real, private price for a decision no one watching from the sidewalk would ever be able to see. Started, as these things always seemed to, with a phone that would not stop. Abina woke to it. Not her alarm, which hadn't sounded yet, but Junho's phone, vibrating against the nightstand in short, relentless bursts. The specific rhythm of a device receiving far more messages than any single morning had any business containing. She reached for her own phone before she was fully awake, some old instinct telling her that a device behaving like that at 6 in the morning was never, in the history of devices, good news arriving early. 14 missed calls. 41 messages. A single text from Efua, sent 9 minutes earlier, that read simply, "Call me. Now, don't look at anything else first." She looked at something else first anyway. The headline loaded a half-second before the article did, the way headlines always seem to arrive just ahead of comprehension. Han Industries heir's secret marriage to Ghanaian trade partner exposed. Beside her, Junho had gone very still, his own phone held close to his face, the blue light of the screen carving hard shadows beneath his eyes in the dim bedroom. She watched him read, watched the exact moment his expression shifted from sleep-fogged confusion to a kind of controlled, professional dread. A man reorganizing an entire mental architecture in real time, floor by floor. "How?" she said. It wasn't really a question. There was no answer yet that would actually help either of them. "I don't know." He set the phone face down, which didn't stop it vibrating, only muffled the sound into something worse, more insistent for being partially hidden. "It's everywhere already. 3 outlets at least. There are photographs." "Photographs of what?" "Of us." "I don't." He scrubbed a hand hard over his face. "Some of them look old. Older than I'd expect." Abina sat up, pulling the sheet with her, some part of her brain already doing the thing it always did under pressure. Cataloging, sorting, triaging, even as the rest of her hadn't yet caught up to the actual size of what was happening around her. A year. A full year of careful, deliberate silence, of the specific choreography required to be married and unmarried at the same time depending on which room you happened to be standing in, gone apparently sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning, without either of them present in the room when it actually happened. "We had 6 weeks, she said. "I know. The vote isn't for 6 weeks. Why now, of all mornings?" "I don't know, Abina." It came out sharper than he'd intended. She could tell immediately. The particular sharpness of a man who was frightened rather than angry, and he caught himself almost as fast as it left him, softened. "I'm sorry. I don't know. I need to call my mother's office before she calls me first, or this gets considerably worse before I've even had the chance to say anything." Her own phone rang. Efua, calling instead of texting this time, insistent, already mid-sentence the moment Abina answered. "It's on every trade desk feed here too. Abina, this isn't staying local to Seoul. People in Accra are seeing it. The ministry contact called me directly this morning asking if it's true." "It's true," Abina said, quiet, watching Junho across the bed already dialing, already becoming visibly in real time a different version of himself, careful, contained, the version built specifically for crisis instead of for Tuesdays. "It's true. I'll call you back within the hour. I need to understand what's actually happening before I can tell you what we're doing about it." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the strange, suspended quiet of a room where 2 phones kept ringing and neither of them answered right away. The last few seconds, though she didn't know it yet, of a version of her life in which privacy had still, technically, existed as a thing she owned. Junho's call connected. She heard the tinny, distant sound of a voice on the other end. Not words yet, just tone, clipped and already unmistakably furious. "Mother," he said, and Abina watched him brace the way you brace for whether you can't yet see but can already feel arriving in your bones. "I need you to tell me what you actually know." Outside the window, Sol was waking up into an entirely ordinary Tuesday, gloriously unaware that the two people watching it from the 40th floor had just run out of the one thing that had made this particular marriage survivable for the last year. Chairwoman Han received the news the way she received all bad news. Standing, not sitting, because sitting was reserved for problems that could afford to wait for her attention. Secretary Yoon stood across the desk with a tablet already open. 3 separate news feeds mirrored across the screen, the story metastasizing in real time even as the two of them watched it happen. Han read without touching the tablet, her hands resting flat against the desk's edge. Still, the particular stillness of a woman running calculations behind an expression designed to give none of them away. "Who?" she said. "We don't know yet. The first outlet to run it credits an anonymous source close to the company. Could be internal. Could be a leak from the across side. It could simply be someone selling old photographs who had no real idea what they were selling until this week made it valuable. Find out. Quietly, for now. I don't want a leak investigation becoming its own second headline before we've finished controlling the first one." Han finally moved, crossing to the window. The city spread out below her in the flat, colorless gray of early morning. How many outlets? 3 as of 11 minutes ago. It will be everywhere by noon, realistically. The vote is in 6 weeks. 5.5, technically, chairwoman. She didn't acknowledge the correction. She was already elsewhere, running the same arithmetic she'd spent 30 years training herself to run instantly and without visible effort, in rooms exactly like this one. A secret marriage to an unapproved foreign partner discovered days, weeks, whatever the precise number turned out to be, before the vote that would determine whether her son kept the company his grandfather had spent his life building. A board that would read this correctly as either deception or poor judgment, and either reading disqualified him under the will's exact language, no room for interpretation. There was no version of wait and see available to her. She had spent her entire adult life understanding that patience was a luxury item, purchased only by people who could afford to lose, and she had never once, not in 30 years, been in a position to afford it. "Draft the response," she said. "What response specifically?" "The marriage was a serious misjudgment on my son's part. Concealed, inappropriate, a lapse we take seriously and are addressing through appropriate channels." She said it evenly, already composing the sentence for the record even as she spoke it aloud for the very first time, the words arriving fully formed because some part of her had, perhaps, been rehearsing a version of them for longer than this single morning. "Contact legal. I want grounds for annulment reviewed by end of day." Secretary Yoon didn't look up from the tablet, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted. The smallest possible hesitation, quickly suppressed and buried under professionalism. "Grounds, chairwoman. On what basis?" "There isn't an obvious. Find a basis." Han turned from the window. "We are not negotiating with a scandal that already has a 5-week head start on us. We are ending it cleanly before it has time to grow teeth of its own." The junior attorney, once the meeting finally convened an hour later, was the one who found the language for it, careful and hedging in a way her senior colleague's confidence had smoothed over. "There's a third option, chairwoman, more aggressive than concealment alone. We could allege the marriage was entered into with foreknowledge of its strategic value to her business relationship with the company. Fraud in the marriage's formation itself, not merely its concealment." The room went quiet for a moment. Han considered it the way she considered most aggressive options, not with any real hesitation, but with the specific, unhurried calculation of a woman deciding not whether something happened to be true, but whether it happened to be usable. "Can we prove it?" "Proving it conclusively would be difficult," the junior attorney admitted. "But annulment proceedings don't require conviction-level proof. They require enough documented basis to file, and enough public plausibility to make withdrawal or simple settlement the path of least resistance for the other party." "So we don't need it to be true," Han said. "We need it filed." Nobody in the room answered that directly, which was, in its own way, its own kind of answer. Draft both, Han said. The fraud information claim, alongside the procedural disqualification. File everything. I want this in front of the board before the news cycle has moved past its first week, while the public framing is still ours to shape rather than react to. The senior attorney made a note, then looked up, choosing his next words with visible, unusual care. I'd advise the chairwoman that the fraud claim specifically is the weakest of the three on the merits. If it's ever challenged aggressively, depositions, discovery, an actual courtroom examination of how the marriage was formed, it may not survive that kind of scrutiny. It doesn't need to survive a courtroom, Han said, already gathering her own folder. Already 3 steps ahead into the rest of a day that had only just begun. It needs to hold for 5.5 weeks. Get me signatures by tomorrow morning. She left before anyone in the room could raise the question, sitting, entirely unasked, in the space behind her. What happened in week 6? Once scrutiny finally arrived after it had stopped mattering whether the filing itself had ever actually held. By evening it had a name, the way these things always, eventually, acquired a name, something short enough to fit comfortably beneath a photograph. Abina watched the segment air from the darkened apartment, the curtains drawn now, a decision she and Junho had arrived at without ever discussing it out loud, the way people arrived at decisions during genuine emergencies. Instinctively, in parallel, landing on the same conclusion without needing to compare notes first. The television was the only light in the room besides the kitchen's, and she sat very straight on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap, watching herself become, in real time, a headline. Gold Digger Bride. They used the lobby photo, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected it to, which surprised her more than the segment itself had. Junho stood behind the couch, arms crossed, reading his phone and the television at once, the specific multitasking of a man trying to absorb bad news through 2 separate channels simultaneously, in case one of them explained something the other one didn't. There's a statement. From my mother's office. Read it. You don't need. Read it, Junho. He read it, flat, the tone of a man reading something he wished, quite badly, that he didn't have to speak aloud in his own voice. The marriage represents a serious misjudgment. The family takes this concealment seriously and is addressing it through appropriate legal channels. Abina absorbed this the way she absorbed all information under real pressure, quietly cataloging it, refusing herself the release of a reaction until she understood the complete shape of what she was reacting to. Legal channels. I don't know what that means yet. Exactly. I think you do. She finally looked away from the screen, up at him. I think appropriate legal channels means she has already decided this marriage is something that can be undone. Not negotiated with. Undone entirely, as though it never happened. He didn't answer right away, which was itself its own kind of answer. The segment cut to a second image, new footage, filmed clearly within the last few hours. A reporter standing outside Han Industries headquarters delivering updates with the practiced urgency of someone who already understood this particular story had legs for at least a week, possibly longer. Behind the reporter, the building's glass facade caught the streetlights and threw them back in long, cold, unbroken lines. Sources close to the family indicate the chairwoman is exploring grounds for annulment, citing concerns over the marriage's legitimacy. Grounds, Abina repeated, quiet, testing the word the way she tested any claim before deciding what exactly to do about it. There are no grounds. We were married legally in front of witnesses over a year ago. What grounds? I don't know. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Something sharp entered his voice for the first time that evening, not aimed at her exactly, but close enough to graze her all the same. The sound of a man who had spent his entire day being managed by people considerably more powerful than himself, with nothing left over except the same helplessness to offer his own wife. I know her, Abina. I know that when she says appropriate channels, she already has at least 3 of them drafted and ready. I don't yet know which one. Abina turned back to the television, where the segment had already begun looping again, the anchor's careful, concerned outrage cycling back to its beginning like a wound reopening itself precisely on schedule. She watched her own face freeze under the word one more time, the same photograph, the same red-edged letters, and felt something in her settle, cold and entirely clear, Underneath the anger, she was still refusing herself the luxury of visibly showing. "Then we find out which one," she said, "before she has the chance to use it." Junho came around the couch and sat beside her, finally, close enough that their shoulders touched the way they had 2 nights earlier, in a version of the same apartment that already felt, somehow, like it belonged to an entirely different life. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing. Tonight." She said it evenly, though it cost her something real to say it. Some part of her straining hard against the specific discipline required to choose stillness while an entire country watched her be called a thief on national television. "I'm not handing her a reaction to build tomorrow's segment out of. Whatever she's constructing, I refuse to be the one who hands her the raw material for it. That's not nothing. That's a decision, and a difficult one. It's the only decision I can currently make with the information I actually have," she said, and reached for the remote and turned the television off. Not because she'd stopped needing to know what was being said about her, but because she had learned a long time ago in a different fight entirely that watching the fire burn didn't put it out. Only knowing exactly where the fuel was hidden did that. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of fresh coffee that nobody in the room was drinking. Han sat at the head of the table, Secretary Yoon to her right, 2 attorneys from the company's outside counsel seated across from them with folders already open and expressions carefully arranged into the specific neutrality of professionals being asked to solve a problem considerably faster than the problem could reasonably be solved. "Concealment of a material fact," the senior attorney said, sliding a page across the polished table. "That's the strongest angle available to us. The marriage was hidden from the board for over a year, during a period in which board approval was a contractual condition of succession eligibility. We can argue the concealment itself constitutes fraud on the family's continued support and involvement in the union. Such as it was." "Such as it was," Han repeated. "There was no financial backing whatsoever. They kept it entirely private. No allowance. No joint accounts touching company funds in any capacity." The attorney's pause was brief, entirely professional, the kind of hesitation that cost nothing to notice and everything, potentially, to act on. "That does weaken the financial fraud angle somewhat. We can still argue procedural concealment, that the marriage violated an implicit condition of the succession structure itself, regardless of any financial entanglement." "Implicit," Han said. "The will's language doesn't explicitly require any particular disclosure timing. It requires a board-approved partnership at the time of the vote. There's a genuine argument that an undisclosed marriage cannot, by definition, have received board approval, and therefore simply doesn't satisfy the condition at all, which would function less like an annulment and more like a straightforward disqualification of the marriage's relevance to the vote." Secretary Yoon spoke for the first time, careful. "That argument doesn't actually end the marriage, Chairwoman. It only removes it from consideration for the succession vote itself." "I'm aware of that distinction," Han said, a thin edge finally entering her voice. "I didn't request a technicality that leaves my son legally married to her regardless of what the board ultimately decides. I asked for grounds to end it entirely." The junior attorney glanced down at her notes before speaking, choosing her words with visible care. "There's a third option, Chairwoman. More aggressive than either of the others. We could allege the marriage was entered into with foreknowledge of its strategic value to her business relationship with the company. Essentially, a claim of fraud in the marriage's formation itself, rather than simply its concealment afterward." The room went quiet for a long moment. Han considered this the way she considered most aggressive options that crossed her desk, not with any real hesitation about whether it happened to be true, but with the unhurried calculation of a woman deciding only whether it happened to be usable. "Can we prove it?" "Proving it conclusively would be difficult," the junior attorney admitted, honest even under obvious pressure not to be. "But annulment proceedings don't require conviction-level proof to move forward. They require enough documented basis to file, and enough public plausibility to make withdrawal the path of least resistance for the other party involved. So we don't need it to be true," Han said again, testing the sentence a second time as though saying it twice might make it easier to live inside. "We need it filed." The senior attorney chose his next words with unusual, deliberate care. "I'd advise the chairwoman that the fraud information claim is, on the actual merits, the weakest of the 3. Challenged aggressively, depositions, discovery, an actual courtroom examination of the marriage's formation, it may very well not hold. It doesn't need to hold in a courtroom, Han said, already gathering her folder, already several steps ahead into the shape of the rest of her afternoon. It needs to hold for 5.5 weeks. Signatures by tomorrow morning. She left before anyone remaining in the room could ask the obvious question hanging in the air behind her. What happened in week 6, when scrutiny finally arrived after it no longer mattered, procedurally, whether the thing had actually held? He found her in the same office she had occupied since he was a teenager. The same desk, repositioned twice across the decades but never once replaced. The same view of the Han Industries campus spread out below the window like a kingdom she had built with her own hands and had never once let him fully inherit before he'd properly earned it in her eyes, an approval he had spent the whole of his adult life failing to permanently secure no matter what he offered her in exchange for it. "You didn't call me," he said, closing the door behind him. "You issued a public statement about my marriage without calling me first." Han didn't look up right away from the document in front of her. "I called you the moment I had something worth telling you, rather than handing you a problem before it had a shape. That isn't the same thing as calling me." "It is exactly the same thing. I have spent 30 years learning the difference between reacting to a crisis and properly responding to one, and it is a difference that has kept this company intact through mornings considerably worse than this one." She finally set the document aside and looked at him directly, her expression carrying the particular blend of exhaustion and total control that he had learned, as a boy, always meant a conversation had already been decided before he'd walked through the door. "Sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to stop." "Stop what, precisely, Junho?" "The annulment, whatever grounds you're inventing for it. Stop before it becomes something none of us can walk back from." Han studied him a long moment, something in her expression quietly recalibrating. The look of a negotiator discovering, in real time, that the person seated across from her wasn't simply going to absorb the terms she'd handed him without pushing back. "You think I enjoy any part of this? I think you're extremely good at it. That's a different thing entirely from not enjoying it. I am protecting the only thing your grandfather left behind that actually matters," she said, and something underneath her control moved, briefly, close enough to notice, gone again before he could be certain of what he'd actually seen. "You want me to set that aside because you have fallen in love with a woman I have met exactly 4 times. I want you to set aside a public humiliation campaign against a woman who has built something entirely real, with her own 2 hands, in a country you have never once bothered to properly understand." Something flickered across Han's face at that, brief, sharp, and gone again before he could name what it had actually been. "Sit down, Junho. I told you. Sit down." Not quite a shout. Not quite a request either, the specific practiced authority of a woman who had never once, in his entire adult life, needed to raise her voice in order to secure his obedience. He sat despite every intention not to, the old muscle memory of a childhood spent in this exact office asserting itself faster than his adult resolve could override it, and hated quietly precisely how easily it had happened, even now, even at his age. Han came around the desk and sat on its edge, close enough that the register of the entire conversation shifted. No longer chairwoman and heir, something closer, however briefly, to a mother and the son she had raised. "The alliance discussion with the Song family proceeds this week regardless," she said. "You will attend the introduction dinner on Thursday. You will be visibly, publicly available, because that is precisely what the board needs to witness in order to approve you at the vote, whatever else is happening beneath the surface of your private life." "I'm not marrying someone else, Mother. I'm already married. You are attending a dinner. Nobody has asked you to sign a single document." Her voice had fully returned to its controlled register now, the brief crack sealed back over as though it had never once opened. Whether the current marriage survives the vote procedurally is an entirely separate question from whether you attend one dinner that keeps your options, and this family's entire succession, intact while that separate question is being properly resolved. "And if I refuse, then you hand Taemin the company by default, and you may explain to your wife, whose entire livelihood depends on this family's trade relationships remaining intact, precisely how that particular decision protected her." Han stood, already reaching for the document she'd set aside the moment he'd walked in. The conversation, from where she stood, entirely concluded. Thursday, 7 o'clock. The navy suit, not the black. Junho stood as well, slower than he'd sat. This isn't finished. No, she agreed, not looking up from her papers. It isn't. That is rather the point of it, Junho. Nothing that actually matters is ever finished as quickly as the people standing inside it would prefer. He left without another word, because there was nothing remaining to say that she hadn't already, somehow, preempted before he'd even thought to say it, and it was only once he was alone in the elevator, watching the floor numbers count silently downward, that he allowed himself to register what the meeting had genuinely cost him. Not a victory, not even a real concession. Simply the private, sinking understanding that the tools which worked reliably on absolutely everyone else in his life did not work on this one, and somewhere on the long descent toward the lobby, he made a decision he wasn't proud of even as he made it. Not to mention the dinner to Abina tonight. Not until he understood, himself, what it actually meant that he had already agreed to attend it. He was seated in the guest suite reviewing the household staff schedule when she found him. Not by design. Simply the ordinary overlap of two people sharing a single roof under increasingly extraordinary circumstances. "You've been quiet since your mother's office," Abina said, settling into the doorway rather than fully entering the room. A habit she developed over the past year of never quite trusting any space in this apartment to be entirely private. "I have a lot on my mind." "That's not an answer, Junho. That's a deflection wearing an answer's clothes." He looked up at her, something careful and unreadable moving behind his expression. "There's an alliance dinner Thursday, with the Song family. My mother arranged it before any of this started. It's part of the succession optics, nothing more than that." Abina went very still in the doorway. "You're going." "I have to. Refusing hands Taemin the company by default, and I'm not doing that. Not to you, not to either of us, not after everything we've already built toward this vote. You didn't think to mention this before I heard it from you, just now after the fact. I'm mentioning it now, after you'd already agreed to it." Something in her voice had gone carefully, deliberately flat. "That's not the same as telling me, Junho. That's informing me of a decision you'd already finished making without me in the room." He set down the schedule, meeting her eyes fully for the first time since she'd appeared in the doorway. "I didn't know how to bring it up without you thinking it meant something it doesn't. I don't get to decide what it means, apparently. You've already decided that part for both of us." She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the kitchen without waiting for whatever he might have said next. Leaving him alone in the guest suite with a staff schedule he no longer had any real interest in reviewing, and the distinct, uncomfortable sense that something between them had just shifted in a direction neither of them had chosen on purpose. She asked him directly on a Wednesday night, the apartment dark except for the small lamp on her side of the bed. The question arriving with no real preamble because by now there was no version of preamble left that either of them hadn't already exhausted. "Taemin, your mother's history. You know things about both of them that you haven't told me. I felt it for weeks now, small moments where you go quiet in a very specific way, a way I've started to recognize. Tell me now. All of it. Not the edited version." The silence that followed went on long enough that she understood, before he even spoke, the general shape of what his answer was going to be. "There isn't anything useful to tell," he said finally. "Old family grievances. History that doesn't change what we're actually dealing with right now. Let me decide what's useful to me." "Abina, let me decide," she said again, quieter, more insistent this time. "You don't get to protect me from information by deciding on my own behalf what I'm capable of handling. I built an entire career reading rooms full of men who believed exactly that about me. I did not expect to marry one of them." He flinched. She felt it more than she actually saw it in the dim light, the small, involuntary recoil of a direct hit landing somewhere true. "That's not fair to say, isn't it? Tell me what's actually different. You are sitting on information about the two people currently trying hardest to destroy us, and you have decided unilaterally that I am better off without it. That is not protection, Junho. That is simply a gentler version of exactly what your mother does to everyone around her. Don't compare me to her. Not tonight of all nights. Then don't give me a reason to." He was quiet for a long moment, and in the dim light she couldn't fully read his face, only the tension in the shape of him. a man deciding in real time whether to cross a threshold he had spent his entire life being carefully taught never to cross. The one between managing a problem quietly, alone, and exposing it messily to someone who might do something with it he couldn't fully predict or control. I attended the dinner, he said instead, which wasn't precisely what she'd asked, but was, she understood immediately, a smaller truth offered in place of the considerably larger one he still wasn't ready to hand over. 4 days ago, with the Song family, my mother arranged it. I know. You told me. I told you after I'd already gone. That's not quite the same as telling you before. No, she agreed. It isn't. He was quiet again, and she let the silence sit between them a while longer this time, unwilling to fill it for him, waiting to see whether he would find his own way further into the honesty she'd asked him for or simply retreat back into the careful, practiced management that had gotten him through every other crisis of his life so far. I know things about Taemin, he said finally, the words coming slower now, more reluctant. Not proof of anything specific, just patterns. He's resented being the backup his entire life, and resentment held that long tends to look for an outlet eventually. I don't know if he leaked the marriage. I've wondered. I haven't told you because I don't have anything solid enough to hand you, and I didn't want you carrying a suspicion I couldn't back up. That's not your decision to make for me. I know that now, he said quietly. I'm telling you anyway. It's not much. It's what I actually have. She studied him a long moment in the low light, something in her chest easing slightly, though not fully. A partial honesty offered was still a partial honesty, and she understood, even as she accepted it, that they were still standing some distance short of the full trust either of them actually needed from the other. Thank you, she said. For that much, at least. She didn't tell him, that night, about the notebook locked in her father-in-law's. No, she caught herself, not her father-in-law's, her husband's mother's company's archive, about the pattern she'd been quietly building for weeks now, cross-referencing board membership records against decades-old contract cycles. She told herself she was simply being careful, the same careful he had just been with her. She recognized, even as she told herself that, exactly how thin the distinction actually was. She went to the study alone the following night, once Junho had finally, reluctantly, gone to bed and sat with her father-in-law's. No, simply the old shipping ledgers spread across the desk, the notebook she'd been filling for weeks open beside them, cross-referencing years against names with the same absorbed, methodical focus she usually reserved for negotiations that mattered. She'd found something new that evening, a pattern, finally sharpening into something closer to a shape, cross-referencing the years the original discrepancies clustered around against decades of board membership records she'd requested weeks earlier and only now, with the leak forcing her hand, had time to properly examine in full. The same name kept recurring across every irregular contract cycle, quietly, consistently, in a role that gave its holder access to exactly the kind of paperwork that could make an inconvenient discrepancy simply disappear before anyone thought to question it. Sangchul's name. Not as a confirmed suspect, not yet. He'd have had access to essentially everything in his role, which alone proved nothing conclusive. But present, every single time, in a way that felt considerably less like coincidence the longer she sat with it under the desk lamp's narrow circle of light. She thought briefly about calling Junho into the room, about laying the notebook open in front of him the way she'd laid herself open at breakfast a week earlier, asking him plainly what he actually knew about the company's history, telling him clearly what she herself had found. She didn't. He's still deciding what I'm ready to hear, she thought, and the thought arrived with more bitterness than she'd expected, given how gently he'd finally delivered his own partial honesty the night before. I am not doing that back to him. I am simply not handing this over until I know precisely what it actually is. It wasn't quite an honest distinction, and she recognized that, dimly, even as she made it, the particular discomfort of watching herself justify a choice she would have criticized instantly and without mercy in someone else. But some older instinct, older than this crisis, older than her father-in-law's, his death, held firm regardless. Information had always been the one thing in her life she controlled completely, the one currency nobody had ever managed to take from her simply by asking nicely for it. She wasn't ready to spend it yet. Not even on the one person in this house who had actually, finally, taken her fear seriously. Junho appeared in the doorway sometime after 11, on his way to check the locks the way he did most nights now, an old habit resurfacing under the new pressure. He glanced at the notebook without asking about it directly. Late night. Couldn't sleep. She closed the notebook casually, the small, practiced motion of a woman used to concealing things in plain sight from people who loved her. How's the research thing going for you? The Taemin questions. Something in his expression flickered, brief and unreadable. Slowly. I'll let you know when there's something real to share. Of course, she said, and neither of them pushed the other any further, and the study settled back into its careful quiet, and somewhere in the space between them, unnamed and entirely unacknowledged by either party, the exact same wall had now, quietly, risen on both sides at once. The retired accountant's name was Mr. Ajay, and he'd agreed to meet her only after her contact Kwame had vouched for her twice over, and only in a cafe far enough from Accra's trade district that no one from either of their professional lives would recognize either of them at a glance. He was older than she'd pictured from his voice on the phone, small and precise in his movements. A man who had spent 30 years in the co-op's own accounting office before the predecessor company was absorbed into what eventually became Han Industries' Ghana division. He studied her for a long moment before saying anything at all, the particular scrutiny of someone deciding carefully how much a stranger's face could reasonably be trusted with. You found the 1987 ledger, he said finally. Not a question. I found a discrepancy in it. Roughly 40% between logged volume and logged payout. I don't yet understand what actually created it. Mr. Ajay was quiet for a while, turning his coffee cup a slow quarter turn against the table, an unconscious gesture that struck her, briefly and rather painfully, as nearly identical to one she'd watched Junho make at their own kitchen table not so very long ago. There was a woman, he said finally, before your time, before mine as well, though I inherited the stories from men who'd actually been there when it happened. She ran the co-op's negotiating position in the early years, foreign-trained, sharper by a wide margin than anyone the company had ever dealt with before her. She built terms that should, by any reasonable measure, have made the co-op wealthy for a generation. What happened to her? The company found a way to make her exceptional terms look, over time, like her own mistake instead of her own success. Quietly across several contract cycles. Payouts adjusted downward from what the original agreement specified, always with some small administrative explanation attached. Currency instability 1 year, storage loss the next, a dozen minor justifications that individually meant nothing at all and, taken together, meant absolutely everything. By the time anyone thought to actually add it up properly, she'd already been pushed out entirely. Replaced. Discredited thoroughly enough that no one remaining wanted to be associated with defending her memory. Abina felt something cold settle low in her chest. The specific stillness of a person watching a shape she'd already half suspected finally resolve fully into focus. Do you have a name for her? Mr. Ajay was quiet for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't quite see the shape of behind his careful expression. I have a name I was told once, a long time ago, by a man who has since passed on himself. I was never entirely certain it was accurate. These things tend to get distorted, retold enough times by enough different people. Tell me anyway, please, he told her. Abina sat very still after he said it, turning the name over in her mind, testing it against everything she already knew. The timeline, the position, the particular, specific cruelty of a pattern she now recognized not simply as historical curiosity but as a blueprint, reused decades later on her. That cannot be a coincidence, she said, quiet, almost entirely to herself. I didn't say it was, Mr. Ajay said, and something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting a very long time for someone to finally ask him the question that made the old story matter again to anyone at all. I have only told you what I actually know. What you choose to do with it is entirely yours to decide, not mine. He left shortly afterward, unwilling to say anything further, protective of an old loyalty she understood without needing him to explain it to her in any more detail. Abina sat alone at the small table for a long while after he'd gone, the coffee between her hands gone entirely cold, the name settling into place alongside everything else she'd gathered. The ledgers, the pattern, the decades-old discrepancy that had never, not once, actually been a simple mistake. It's her, she thought, and the thought arrived with none of the triumph she might once have expected to feel at finally solving something this large and this old. Just a quiet, vertiginous grief, the specific grief of understanding an enemy's cruelty as inherited rather than invented from nothing, and knowing that understanding it changed absolutely nothing about what it had already cost her personally, and quite possibly everything about what she now had to decide to do with the knowledge. Efua flew in 2 days later, unannounced except for a text sent from the airport. Landing in an hour, don't argue, you need someone in the room who isn't your husband, and Abina had never, in an entire decade of friendship, been more genuinely relieved to be told exactly what to do by someone else. They sat together in Abina's actual office, 40 floors below the apartment, the blinds drawn against a city that still, occasionally, photographed her through unexpected angles she hadn't anticipated. The evidence was spread across the desk between them now. The ledgers, the underlying contract, the timeline Abina had built and carefully rebuilt 3 separate times since the night she'd first understood its full shape. Walk me through what happens if you actually publish this, Efua said. All the way through, start to finish. Not the part where Han goes down publicly. The part that comes after that. The board sees proof that the succession vote is being conducted by a chairwoman whose own founding history is directly implicated in the company's original practices. At minimum, it delays the vote significantly. At maximum, it disqualifies her entirely from continuing to control the proceedings at all. And Junho, Abina was quiet for a moment. The will's exact language ties his eligibility to a board-approved marriage at the specific time of the vote. If the vote gets thrown into genuine chaos, delayed, contested, run under entirely new oversight because his mother's credibility publicly collapses, there's no real guarantee the succession structure itself survives intact enough for the marriage clause to even matter to anyone by the end of it. He could lose his eligibility not because of anything he actually did wrong, but simply because the entire mechanism he was counting on stops functioning cleanly. And the trade partnership. Yours. This was the part Abina had been quietly circling for nearly 2 days now without saying it aloud, even to herself, let alone to Efua. The partnership exists precisely because of the very structure this discovery indicts directly. If I expose how the original relationship was built, on the erasure of a competent outsider, on manufactured discrepancies designed specifically to push her out, I am not only exposing Han's history. I am simultaneously exposing the foundation my own entire career is currently standing on. There is no clean version of this where I discredit the mechanism and still get to keep standing on top of it afterward. Efua sat back in her chair, absorbing this fully for what looked like the first time. So there's no version of this where you actually win everything. There's no version where I win everything, Abina confirmed, and saying it aloud made it fully, undeniably real in a way that 2 full days of private calculation somehow hadn't quite managed to. I use this and I might save my name and lose the marriage entirely. Or save the marriage and lose the partnership. Or lose all 3 of them trying to thread a needle that may not actually have a hole in it at all. Or I sit on it, and I let them finish erasing me instead, cleanly, without ever once firing a shot I couldn't fully control the landing of. Sitting on it isn't really a genuine choice for you, though, is it? No, Abina admitted. I only needed to say the alternative out loud once, so I understood exactly what I was choosing not to do, before I chose something else instead. Efua reached across the desk. Not for the papers, for Abina's hand instead. What do you actually want? Not the strategic answer you'd give a board. The real one. Abina opened her mouth for something composed, something that would have sounded, to anyone else listening, like clarity, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that nothing composed actually arrived when she reached for it. I don't know, she said instead, and it cost her something real to admit it out loud. I want to be right, publicly, undeniably right, in a way no one can later argue with. I've wanted that since a man took credit for my work early in my career and I swore, privately, that no one would ever again get to tell a more convenient story about me than the true one. But I don't know if I can want the marriage itself without immediately turning it into something I have to manage, the way I manage a counterparty in a negotiation. And I hate that particular fact about myself more than I've said out loud to anyone, including you right now. Efua didn't offer easy comfort in response. She simply held on to Abina's hand and let the silence do whatever work neither of them currently had the right words for. Mrs. Song, not the Song family of the alliance discussions, an old friend from a part of Han's life she rarely spoke of at all, arrived at the residence entirely unannounced, the specific privilege of a friendship old enough by now that it no longer required an appointment to be honored. "You look terrible," Mrs. Song said, settling into the chair across from Han without waiting to be formally invited to sit. "I currently have a company to run through a succession crisis. I don't have time to look otherwise, and I'm not sure why that surprises you. You have time. You are choosing not to take any of it, which is an entirely different thing." Mrs. Song studied her for a long moment, the particular scrutiny of someone who had known Han before she'd finished constructing the version of herself the rest of the world now dealt with exclusively. "I saw the broadcast. That girl's face under that word. It made me think of something I haven't allowed myself to think about in a very long time." Han's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Don't. I am going to say it anyway, because I am the only person left alive who actually remembers it, and you have spent 30 years making certain no one else ever would." Mrs. Song leaned forward slightly. "You could stop this, Han. Today, right now, this afternoon. Call the broadcast desk yourself. Issue a correction. Negotiate instead of erase her entirely. You have that power. You have always had exactly that power. I have simply never once heard you explain, even to me, why you consistently choose the other option instead, every single time it's presented to you. Because the other option actually works," Han said flat. "Negotiation is slow. It requires the other party to act in good faith, and it requires time I do not currently have to spare. Control is faster. Control has kept this company alive for 30 consecutive years. Control kept you alive for 30 years, Mrs. Song said, quieter now, no longer performing the friendly needling of a moment earlier. There is a real difference, and I think you already know it, even if you've never once let yourself sit with that knowledge long enough to say it out loud, even to yourself." Han stood and crossed to the window, the old, practiced gesture of a woman ending a conversation by physically removing herself from its center. "I was young. I was foreign to the position I held, entirely unproven, easy for anyone to discredit. I learned, the hard way, that competence without genuine institutional power is simply an open invitation for someone else to take what you built. I am not going to apologize for having learned that particular lesson thoroughly. No one is asking you to apologize for having learned it," Mrs. Song said. "I am asking whether you have noticed that you are currently teaching that exact same lesson to someone else. The precise same lesson, delivered in precisely the same way it was once delivered to you." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Mrs. Song began, quietly, to wonder if she had finally said the one thing that would actually land, watching Han's shoulders still turned toward the window, for any sign at all of the old wound surfacing where she could actually see it happen. "It is not the same," Han said finally, and her voice, when it finally came, had gone strangely quiet, almost young in a way Mrs. Song hadn't heard from her in decades. "I am protecting my son. Were you protected when it happened to you?" Another silence, longer this time. "No," Han said. "I protected myself, because no one else did it for me. And now you are doing to her exactly what was once done to you, and calling it protection, because you have never once let yourself properly name what actually happened to you when it did." Mrs. Song stood and crossed to where Han stood at the window, and for a moment the two of them simply stood together, looking out at the same gray skyline neither of them was truly seeing at all. "You could still stop, Han. Even now." Han was quiet for a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that looked, for just a fraction of a second, almost like grief finally finding a door left slightly ajar after 30 years of being kept sealed shut. Then it closed again. "It is not the same," she said again, firmer this time. The crack sealed back over with the particular finality of a woman deliberately choosing not to walk through a door she had just, briefly, been shown. "I have a company to protect. I have a son to protect. I do not have room remaining for anything else right now, and I would ask you not to press me further on this today." Mrs. Song looked at her for a long moment, something like genuine sorrow crossing her own face. Not surprise exactly, more the specific grief of watching an old friend confirm, definitively and for the last time, a fear she had carried quietly for decades on Han's behalf. "All right," she said finally, and gathered her coat, and left without further argument, because some doors, she understood by now, could only ever be opened from the inside, and Han had just proven, one final time, that she had no genuine intention of reaching for the handle herself. Taemin made his decision on a Tuesday, though he wouldn't have been able to say, if pressed, exactly what had tipped it, only that he'd spent 3 full days turning Abina's question over in his mind, what do you actually want, underneath the company itself, and had found, each time he turned it over again, that he didn't much care for the answer he kept arriving at whenever he imagined handing his information over to his aunt instead of to her. He requested the meeting through Secretary Yoon, who arranged it without asking a single question, the specific professional discretion of a woman who had learned, over long years of service to Han, not to require explanations for matters positioned well above her own role to explain. You wanted to see me, Han said when he arrived, not looking up fully from the documents already spread across her desk. I have information about the leak. That finally got her attention. She set the document down and studied him with the particular sharpness she typically reserved for conversations she hadn't fully anticipated in advance. Go on, then. I know who sold the photographs to the first outlet. He let the silence sit a beat, watching her reaction carefully, calibrating his next words against exactly what he saw surface in her expression. It wasn't Abina's side. It wasn't a rival board faction either, which I strongly suspect is what you've been quietly assuming this entire time. It was someone inside your own communications office, selling access for straightforward money, entirely unrelated to any larger strategy. Ordinary greed. Nothing more sophisticated than that, in the end. Han's expression didn't visibly change, though something behind it recalibrated all the same. The specific adjustment of a woman discovering that a threat she'd been treating as strategic was, in fact, simply mundane and small. Why are you telling me this? Because I could have told her instead. I genuinely considered it. He said it plainly, watching her carefully now, aware that whatever he said next would define, in some real and lasting way, the remainder of his position within this family going forward. I'm telling you because I want something in exchange, and I would rather ask for it directly than continue waiting for someone to eventually offer it to me on their own. The way I've been waiting my entire life so far. What do you want? A real seat. Not the parenthetical version I've had my whole life. Not and his cousin, also a possibility, should circumstances ever require it. An actual role in this company's future, regardless of how the succession vote ultimately resolves. Something that isn't entirely contingent on Junho losing everything first. Han studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving visibly behind her eyes, though underneath the calculation, for the briefest instant, something that might genuinely have been recognition. A woman who understood, better than almost anyone else alive, the specific, gnawing hunger of being permanently cast as the acceptable alternative rather than ever being the actual choice. I'll consider it, she said finally. That's not a yes. It is not a no either, and given the position you currently occupy, I would suggest you take what is actually being offered rather than what you privately wish were being offered instead. Han's voice had returned fully to its usual controlled register now. The conversation, from her side of the desk, essentially concluded. Give me the source's name. I'll deal with the leak internally, quietly, before it has the chance to become a second story stacked on top of the first one. Taemin gave her the name and left the office without fully understanding whether he'd just secured something genuinely real for himself or simply confirmed, once again, that he was the kind of man who got used by people considerably more decisive than himself. But for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, the not knowing felt less like defeat and more like the ordinary uncertainty of a man who had, finally, actually made a real choice instead of simply waiting to see which direction the wind eventually decided to blow him. The name Taemin gave her led nowhere especially threatening. A junior communications staffer, quietly terminated within the hour. The leak's true origin reduced to precisely the mundane greed he described. It should have settled something in Han. Instead, cross-referencing the staffer's access logs in the aftermath, she found something else entirely. An archival records request, weeks old now, logged under a name that made her go very still at her desk for a long, uncomfortable moment. Abina. Requesting summary ledgers on 1987 Cocoa contracts. Han did not need the full picture in front of her to understand, immediately and completely, exactly what that particular request meant. She had spent 30 years ensuring no one ever thought to look at those specific years closely enough to ask the right question of them. Someone finally had. Yoon, she said, and her voice, when it came, had lost something of its usual measured control entirely. Not panic exactly, but its close, careful cousin. The sound of a woman recalculating a defense she had believed, until this exact moment, was permanently, unassailably secure. I need the annulment filing moved forward. And I need the vote itself brought forward as well, if there is any procedural mechanism at all that allows for it. Secretary Yoon looked up, genuinely surprised by the urgency in a voice she rarely, if ever, heard carry it. Moved forward to when, Chairwoman, as soon as it is legally possible to do so, days, not weeks. The board will ask why. Sudden acceleration this close to an already contested filing will draw considerably more scrutiny, not less of it. Let them ask whatever they like. Han was already moving, already 3 full steps ahead of the conversation itself, the particular momentum of a woman choosing speed over soundness because soundness, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, no longer felt like something she had the luxury of time to properly afford. I would rather answer questions about timing than answer questions about anything else that might surface if this is permitted to drag on much longer than it already has. Secretary Yoon didn't press the matter any further, though something in her expression, carefully neutral as always, quietly registered the shift taking place in front of her. The first time in years of direct service that she had watched Chairwoman Han visibly choose speed over certainty, fear over careful calculation, and understood, without being told outright, that whatever had prompted it was considerably larger than anything currently visible on the immediate surface of this crisis. I'll have the revised timeline to you within the hour, she said, and left to begin making it happen. And Han remained at the window a moment longer, alone, the city entirely indifferent below her, carrying inside herself, for the first time in 3 full decades, a fear that had become, quietly, uncomfortably, entirely personal. She waited until the apartment was empty, Junho gone to another of his mother's newly summoned meetings, the particular kind of evening errand he no longer explained in any real detail and she no longer bothered asking about directly, before she spread everything across the kitchen table. The summary ledgers, the underlying 1987 contract, Mr. Ajay's name, and the internal Han Industries organizational charts she'd pulled going back 4 full decades, cross-referenced now against board. Appointment records that were technically public but functionally invisible to anyone who didn't already know precisely where to look for them. She built the timeline methodically, the way she built any negotiation position, fact by verified fact, refusing herself the comfort of a conclusion until the evidence itself had properly earned one. The co-op's negotiating position run by a woman whose name matched, precisely, the maiden name listed in a decades-old shareholder registration document. A name Abina had found only because she'd finally allowed herself to search for it directly, once Mr. Ajay's story had given her something specific enough to actually search for in the first place. The same woman's departure from the co-op's negotiating team, formalized in a single unadorned line of an old personnel record, no explanation whatsoever attached to it. A marriage announcement, buried inside an old corporate newsletter scan, uniting that same woman's name with the founder's son. The woman who had built the terms that should have made the co-op wealthy for a full generation, discredited quietly, pushed out, replaced entirely, and then, within 2 years, married into the very family whose company had engineered her erasure in the first place. Abina sat back from the table, the pieces arranged in front of her with a clarity that felt considerably less like triumph and considerably more like grief settling slowly into her chest, heavy and entirely cold. Han was her, she thought. Han was the outsider they broke, decades before I ever arrived in this family. She understood it now with a completeness that made her hands go still against the table's edge. Understood that Chairwoman Han had not simply chosen cruelty toward Abina at random, had not selected Gold Digger as a weapon out of thin air. She had chosen the exact shape of the violence once done to her, decades earlier, by a family that had decided a competent outsider's success was a threat to be quietly dismantled rather than a partnership to be genuinely honored. And Han, having survived it, having married into the very structure that erased her, had spent the decades since becoming the machine that had once nearly destroyed her, because becoming it, she had apparently decided somewhere along the way, was considerably safer than remaining permanently its target. She isn't doing this to me because she thinks I'm a genuine threat, Abina realized, and the thought landed with a vertigo unlike anything the public humiliation of the last several weeks had managed to produce in her. She's doing this because I remind her of herself, before she learned to survive by becoming this instead of remaining that. It should have made her angrier. Instead, it made something in her go quiet and strange, the specific disorientation of discovering that her antagonist was not a stranger's cruelty but a mirror's, that the woman trying to erase her had once been erased in precisely the same way, by precisely the same kind of institutional machinery, and had never once, in all the decades since, found a way to properly name what had actually happened to her. Abina sat alone at the table for a long time, the evidence spread out in front of her, the full shape of it finally visible in its entirety, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable to hold, that she was no longer simply holding a weapon aimed at an enemy. She was holding a mirror aimed at a wound that predated her by decades, one that implicated not only Han's cruelty but the entire trade relationship Abina's own career currently depended on. Built as it was on the same foundation, this discovery now threatened to crack open for good. She didn't call anyone that night. Not Efua, not Kwame, not Junho, whose key she heard turn in the door almost an hour later. His footsteps crossing toward the kitchen where she still sat, unmoved, in front of evidence she hadn't yet decided what to do with. He stopped in the doorway, reading something in her stillness before she'd said a single word. Abina. His voice was careful, uncertain. What is it? She looked up at him, the weight of everything she now knew sitting heavy behind her eyes, and for the first time in weeks felt the specific, exhausting pull of a decision she could no longer reasonably postpone. I found it, she said. I found what your mother's been protecting this entire time. She didn't tell him yet, that night, precisely what it was. But something in the room had already changed the moment she said even that much. The quiet, irreversible shift of a story crossing over from something she was investigating entirely alone into something that was, from this point forward, going to belong to both of them, whether either of them felt fully ready for that or not. Efua found her the next morning already at her desk, blinds drawn against a city that still occasionally photographed her through unexpected angles. The evidence spread across the desk between them once again. Walk me through what happens if you actually use this, Efua said. All the way through, start to finish. Not simply the part where Han goes down publicly. The board sees proof that the succession vote is currently being conducted by a chairwoman whose own founding history is directly implicated in the company's original practices. At minimum, it delays the vote significantly. At maximum, it disqualifies her from continuing to control the proceedings at all. And Junho. Abina was quiet a moment. If the vote is thrown into genuine chaos, there's no guarantee the succession structure survives clean enough for the marriage clause to matter to anyone by the time it's over. He could lose his eligibility not because of anything he did, but simply because the mechanism itself stops functioning. And the partnership. Yours. That's the part one keeps circling, Abina admitted. The partnership exists because of the very structure this discovery indicts. There is no version of this where I discredit the mechanism and still get to stand cleanly on top of it afterward. Efua sat with that a long moment. So there's no version where you win everything. There's no version where I win everything, Abina confirmed, and saying it aloud a second time made it no easier to carry than it had been the first. I use this and I might save my name and lose the marriage, or save the marriage and lose the partnership, or lose all three, threading a needle that might not have a hole in it. Or I sit on it, and let them finish erasing me instead, cleanly, without ever firing a shot I couldn't control the landing of. What do you actually want? Efua asked, quieter now. Not the strategic answer. Abina opened her mouth for something composed and found, again, that nothing composed arrived. I don't know, she said, and it cost her to admit it a second time. I want to be right, publicly, undeniably. I also don't know if I can want the marriage without it becoming something I manage, the way I manage a negotiation. I hate that about myself more than I've let myself say out loud. Efua didn't offer easy comfort. She simply reached across the desk and held on, and let the silence carry whatever neither of them had the words for yet. She laid it all out on the kitchen table that evening, the same table where, weeks earlier, they'd agreed that silence was the only responsible choice available to either of them, a certainty that had turned out to be wrong about nearly everything except their reasons for having chosen it in the first place. The original trade relationship, she said, the one my entire partnership sits on top of. It was founded on erasing a woman who built terms too good for the company to let her keep credit for. They discredited her across several contract cycles, pushed her out, and within 2 years she married into the very family that had done it to her. She watched it land. "It's your mother, Junho." His face had gone very still. "You're certain? As certain as documents 37 years old will ever let anyone be. How long have you known?" "A week. A week." He said it flatly, and something in his voice wasn't relief, wasn't gratitude. It was closer to the specific injury of a man realizing he'd asked her, directly, to stop carrying things alone, and she'd carried the single largest thing anyway, for 7 more days without him. "You told me to loop you in. You said it yourself, that same conversation, the same sin at different scales. And then you found this, and you sat on it for a full week. I know how that looks. It doesn't just look like something, Abina. It is something. I wasn't managing you," she said, though even as the words left her, she heard how close they sounded to exactly the kind of thing he'd once told her that had made her genuinely furious. "I didn't know what it meant yet. I didn't know if telling you before I understood the full shape of it would just be handing you a partial fear to carry instead of a complete one. That's the same reasoning I used with you. Word for word. Nearly." She didn't have a ready answer for that. They sat with it, the silence between them not comfortable this time, not the kind that didn't need filling. The kind both of them recognized, plainly, as unfinished business neither of them yet had the tools to properly close in a single conversation. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't cost something," he said finally. "The trust part. I don't know yet what it costs. I just know I can't tell you it's fine because it isn't, not entirely, not yet, and pretending otherwise would just be one more version of managing you." "I don't want you to tell me it's fine," Abina said. "I want you to actually decide, once you understand what I found, whether you can still be in this with me. That's a harder thing to ask you to promise, and it's the only honest one I have left to offer." He was quiet a long moment, and then he asked her to walk him through all of it, the ledger, the contract, Mr. Ajay, the shareholder filing, and she did, fact by fact, watching him absorb something that reorganized, in real time, 30 years of a relationship he had never fully understood the foundation of. When she finished, neither of them reached for the other's hand right away. It was the first time in weeks that felt less like distance and more like two people finally standing in the same weather together, even if neither of them yet knew for certain whether they'd come through it standing on the same side. He went to his mother alone the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the buildings. Han was already at her desk, as she always was, the tablet with its endless feeds glowing faintly even in the daylight. She looked up when he entered, something in her face bracing before he'd said a single word, the specific readiness of a woman who had learned, across decades, to anticipate confrontation before it fully arrived. "I know," he said, no preamble. "About 1987, the co-op negotiations. What actually happened to you?" Han went very still. "I know you were the woman they discredited. I know you married into this family 2 years after they broke you. I've spent my whole life watching you become the exact machine that once destroyed you, and calling it protection the entire time." "Get out," Han said, quiet, controlled, though something underneath the control had gone entirely white. "No." He stayed exactly where he was, the first time in his adult life he could remember refusing that specific instruction from her. "I'm not managing this anymore. I'm not attending dinners I don't believe in. I'm not deciding what Abina's allowed to know. I'm not pretending I don't see what you're doing to her. You don't understand what you are threatening to unravel. Then help me understand it. Why didn't you ever tell me any of it?" Han didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice carried none of the chairwoman's usual register. Something older, more guarded, and still, even now, unwilling to fully open. "Because some things do not survive being said out loud. You do not need the whole history to understand the decision in front of you. I have made a decision. I intend to see it through, even knowing what I know now. Especially knowing what you know now." Something in her had hardened again, the crack, if it had briefly been one, sealing over faster than he'd hoped for. "Sympathy for what happened to me 30 years ago does not obligate me to lose to her today." He hadn't quite expected that, had, somewhere on the drive over, half believed that simply saying it aloud would be enough to stop her. It wasn't. Whatever had moved behind her eyes for that one instant when he'd first spoken had already retreated somewhere he couldn't reach it. Then I am withdrawing from the Song Alliance, he said. Publicly today. I am telling the board my marriage stands, and that the grounds you have filed will not survive real scrutiny, because I know exactly how thin they are. And I am telling you right now, if you continue this, you will lose me. Not the company. Not the succession. Me. Your actual son. Permanently. Han looked at him a long time. You would choose her over this family. I would choose not spending the rest of my life managing everyone around me the way you have spent yours managing everyone around you. He held her gaze. That includes you. I am choosing that too. Even if it costs me you. He left without waiting for an answer, because he understood, for the first time, that the answer was no longer his to extract from her. Whatever she did next, she would have to arrive at it herself, and he walked out not knowing whether she would, or whether the woman capable of arriving at it had actually survived as long as Han had always insisted she had. The board convened on the 9th day. Abina had not been formally invited. Her attorney, retained 2 days earlier over her own initial resistance to needing one at all, had confirmed she held the right to the floor regardless of the board's stated preference otherwise. Han sat at the head of the table, composed, though something in her stillness that particular morning read differently than in every previous meeting. Abina had watched her chair. I'll be brief, Abina said, once the floor was properly granted to her. The grounds filed against this marriage allege that I entered it with foreknowledge of its strategic value to my business relationship with this company. She placed a folder on the table, not toward any single man in the room. The partnership I built was completed 18 months before the marriage became a legal fact anyone here needs to consider. The terms speak for themselves. A board member near the far end, a man she hadn't met before, spoke before she could continue. With respect, terms negotiated 18 months prior don't preclude a relationship pursued afterward with an eye toward exactly this outcome. Timing of the deal doesn't settle the actual question of intent. It landed harder than she'd expected. The first real resistance in the room, not from Han but from someone with nothing obviously to gain from doubting her. She held his gaze a beat before answering. No, she said. It doesn't entirely on its own. Which is why I'd ask the board to consider something considerably larger than the timing of my marriage. She placed the second document down, the 1987 contract, cross-referenced against the 1991 shareholder filing. In the course of an unrelated audit, I found a pattern of manufactured discrepancies in this company's founding trade agreements, used across several contract cycles to discredit and remove a negotiator whose terms were, by every available metric, exceptional. That negotiator's name, prior to marriage, matches a name in this company's own shareholder history. The room had gone very quiet. She let the silence hold a moment before saying the rest. I'm not asking the board to punish anyone for a history none of us were present for. I'm asking the board to recognize that the grounds filed against my marriage were built by the same instinct that built this company's foundation, the instinct to protect the institution by discrediting whoever it finds inconvenient, rather than examine whether the inconvenience might actually be true. I'd ask that the annulment be withdrawn, and the vote proceed on terms that don't depend on erasing someone to stay intact. For a moment nobody moved. Then the same board member who challenged her leaned forward. This is a serious allegation against the chairwoman personally. Do you have anything beyond the documents in front of us? Testimony, records custody, anything that would survive a direct challenge to authenticity? It was the question she'd been afraid of since the moment she'd decided to walk into this room. I have a witness, she said. A former employee of the co-op, willing to speak to the pattern, though not, understandably, eager to be dragged through a public proceeding for it. I have the original ledgers, held by this company's own archive, signed for under my own name, discoverable by anyone who wants to verify the chain. That's not nothing, the board member said slowly. It isn't everything either. Han had not spoken. She sat at the head of the table, hands folded very still, and for a moment it seemed genuinely possible, the room's certainty visibly wavering, that thin as the annulment's grounds actually were, they might still hold simply because no one present wanted to be the one who broke 30 years of deference first. Then Han spoke. The claim is accurate, she said. The room turned toward her as one. Abina felt something in her chest go very still. I won't dignify a courtroom examination of my own history, Han continued, her voice even, giving away nothing beyond the words themselves. I also won't sit in this room and watch this board pretend an uncertainty it doesn't actually feel. For the sake of protecting a filing I know, better than anyone here, was never built to survive real scrutiny. She looked briefly at no one in particular. Withdraw the annulment. Proceed with the vote as originally scheduled, with whatever oversight the board deems necessary given the irregularities in how it was recently handled. It was not an apology. It was not, Abina understood watching her, anything close to surrender. It was, if anything, the last and most complete act of control available to a woman who had spent 30 years deciding, alone, exactly how every story about her would end, including, apparently, this one. They found a private room off the board floor once the meeting adjourned, the vote itself delayed pending review, an outcome that satisfied no one entirely and, in its own uncertainty, felt considerably more honest than a clean resolution could ever have managed to feel. You knew, Han said, without turning from the window, before you walked in there. You knew what she'd found. I knew last night. She told me. I told her what I'd been holding back too. Han didn't answer that directly. Mrs. Song told you she came to see me. She told Abina. Abina told me. And you think that's meant to move me? I don't know what's meant to move you, Junho said. Honest in a way he'd rarely been permitted to be with her before. I don't think I ever have. Han turned, finally, and her face carried something he hadn't seen there in his entire life. Not composure, not its absence exactly either, something harder to name. A woman standing at the edge of a version of herself she had spent 30 years refusing to visit. I am not going to explain myself to you today, she said. I don't know that I owe you the explanation as much as I owe it to myself, and I haven't finished deciding whether I'm capable of giving it, even privately, even now. That's not nothing, Junho said, quietly. No, she agreed. It isn't. It also isn't forgiveness, and I'd ask you not to mistake it for that. He nodded slowly. I don't know if I can forgive what you tried to do to her. I don't know if I want to, yet. I understand more of you than I did yesterday. That's not the same thing. No, Han said again. It isn't. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them. It was, Junho understood, leaving the room a few minutes later, the most honest conversation they had ever had, and also, unmistakably, an unfinished one with no promise attached that it would ever be finished at all by either of them on any particular timeline. Abina was waiting on the building's exterior steps, the afternoon light flat and gray, the specific hour after something enormous happens when the world simply continues anyway, indifferent, cars still moving, strangers still walking past with their own unrelated urgencies entirely intact. Junho came down the steps slowly, and she saw it on him before he said anything. Not devastation, something quieter and more tiring than that. How is she? Abina asked. I don't know yet. I don't think she knows either. He sat beside her on the cold stone. I told her I'd choose you over the family. I meant it. I still mean it. I didn't understand, until I said it out loud, how much it would actually cost to mean it. What did it cost? My whole life. I've been the good son who found a way to satisfy everyone without paying anything real for it. That was the thing I was actually proud of. Not the company, my own cleverness at never having to choose. I don't have that anymore. He looked at her. I don't know if she'll ever really let me back in. I don't know if I want her to, exactly as she was. I know what I have with you, though. Or I think I do. You do, Abina said, and it cost her something too, though a different kind, the particular vulnerability of saying a true thing without a document to back it up. They sat together for a while, not speaking, the city moving around them in its ordinary indifferent way. It was not, Abina understood, the moment that would decide whether any of it had actually been worth it. That moment, she suspected, was still some distance off, and would arrive quietly on an entirely ordinary day, long after anyone else was watching either of them closely. 3 days later, back in Accra, Efua found her staring at an email she hadn't answered. You've read that 4 times, Efua said, setting down 2 coffees. What is it? The board wants to formalize an expanded regional directorship. Under my name specifically. Full authority over West Africa negotiations. Abina turned the laptop so Efua could see. They're citing the last 2 months, framing it as proof of judgment under pressure. That's an enormous opportunity. Why do you look like it's a threat instead? Because I haven't built the case yet for why I deserve it. Not on paper. It just arrived. Because of what happened, not because I've proven anything new since. Efua looked at her a long moment, gently exasperated. The look of a woman who'd watched this pattern for a decade and had run out of patience for it. You built an 18-month partnership from nothing. You held a smear campaign to a standstill without losing your composure once. You found and dismantled a 37-year cover-up while fighting for your own marriage. What exactly do you think you still have to prove? I don't know, Abina admitted. I think some part of me is always going to feel like I need one more piece of evidence before I'm allowed to take something good without earning it twice. So don't earn it twice. Just take it. Efua closed the laptop gently. You don't have to build a case for this one. Someone's offering you something you've already earned. You're allowed to just say yes. Abina sat with that, the old instinct rising, draft a response, outline the qualifications, make the acceptance itself another piece of unimpeachable proof, and, for the first time she could clearly remember, let the instinct pass without acting on it. She reopened the laptop, typed 3 words. No qualifiers. Thank you. Accepted. She hit send before she could talk herself into adding anything else. How does it feel? Efua asked, smiling slightly. Terrifying, Abina said. And a little bit like breathing. The apartment looked the same as it always had, though something in the quality of the light, or perhaps just in the 2 people standing inside it, felt different in a way Abina couldn't fully name. Junho was by the window when she came in. I talked to my mother again today. Briefly. She's not the same. I don't know if she ever will be. She said something true for maybe the first time I can remember, that she doesn't know how to be different, but she's willing to find out slowly, if I'm still willing to be her son while she does. What did you say? That I would. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. Abina crossed the room and stood in front of him. I don't need you to have it figured out. I spent my whole life needing everything figured out before I'd let myself want it. I'm trying to stop. With the directorship. With Efua. She made herself finish it. With you. I'm trying to let this be real without building the case for why I've earned it first. Have you built the case? No, she said, and something in saying it plainly, without qualification, felt like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. I haven't. I'm choosing this anyway. But I want you to know, the week I sat on what I found before I told you, that wasn't nothing. I don't want to pretend it was. I know, he said. I'm not going to pretend the week you didn't tell me about the dinner was nothing either. We're not clean, either of us. I don't think clean was ever actually on offer to people like us. No, she agreed. I don't think it was. He reached out and took her hand. Not a resolution with a certified edge, just an agreement made in real time by 2 people choosing, again, to keep choosing each other imperfectly without the paper trail that would have made it safe. We're going to want to manage things again, he said. Both of us. Probably soon. Probably, she said. We just have to keep catching it. Keep choosing to say the true thing instead of managing it quietly. Over and over. That's not a thing we get to solve once. I think that might be the actual marriage, he said. Not the part where we get it right and it stays right. The part where we keep choosing to say it, especially when it would be easier not to. She studied him a long moment. A man who had walked away from the only version of himself he'd ever known how to be, who had lost his mother's easy approval and possibly more of her than he yet understood, offering her something she hadn't finished proving she deserved. She took it anyway. It wasn't a resolution. It was, for tonight, enough. 6 months later, the trade office in Accra had expanded to fill the floor above the one it occupied a year earlier. Efua's name now on a door of her own, the regional directorship thriving on its own merits, by every metric Abina still occasionally checked out of old habit. In Seoul, the succession vote had confirmed Junho, delayed but not derailed. The board persuaded less by sentiment than by the plain fact that the annulment's collapse had left no alternative candidate whose claim wasn't itself compromised by the same scrutiny. Tae-min had been given a genuine operational role overseeing the company's expanding West African partnerships, a position that put him in regular contact with Abina's office. Neither of them had asked for the arrangement directly. Both had come, cautiously, to find it workable. Occasionally, even something like collegial, in the particular way two people who'd once eyed each other warily could eventually settle into a working peace neither had fully expected. Chairwoman Han had stepped back from day-to-day control. Not entirely, not dramatically, but enough that the shift was visible to anyone who'd watched her run a room for 30 years. She and Junho spoke now, irregularly, carefully, the slow, uneven work of two people learning a language neither of them had ever been taught. It wasn't repaired. It was, Junho had said once, quietly, to Abina, something being attempted, and they'd both agreed that was the more honest word for it anyway. Abina stood at the window of her new office, the Harmattan haze softening the skyline the way it always did this time of year, and thought about a woman 37 years ago who had built terms too good for anyone to let her keep credit for, and who had spent 3 decades since becoming the very thing that had once tried to erase her. She didn't know if Han would ever fully find her way out of that. She knew she had found her way to a different ending. That had to be worth something, even if it wasn't everything. Her phone buzzed. 3 words, no context needed after 6 months of the same small ritual. Coffee's getting cold. She smiled, closed the laptop on a report that would keep until tomorrow, and left the office where she no longer had to prove, to anyone, including herself, that she belonged in it.